Hi everyone, welcome or welcome back to Misinformation in Science and Society. Here to listen, not to judge. I'm your host Annie, and today with us we have Henry Ajder. All right, welcome. So could you please introduce yourself a little bit and what you do?
Sure. My name's Henry Ajder. I'm an expert on generative AI and deepfakes, specifically looking at how these technologies are impacting society. I've been working for about 6 years to try and map this landscape of both positive and negative uses. But unfortunately, a lot of that has fallen into mapping negative uses, such as image abuse against women, disinformation, cybersecurity threats, and things like this.
Mm-hmm. So why did you choose this career initially, and what's your favorite part of doing what you do?
Hmm. I mean, I didn't really choose the career I found myself in. It's been quite serendipitous how I've sort of stumbled along, in a sense. I was really interested in AI when I was doing my academic studies in philosophy and the kind of new challenges that these technologies were creating, which we didn't have systems to really deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really kind of started just digging into this space of all of these new emerging technologies that used AI. And I came across deepfakes in late 2017, and I sort of had a feeling that this was going to be really significant, was going to really change the world. And so off the back of that, I, did some research, joined one of the first deepfake detection companies, did some more research there, and as one of the first people to be doing this, I really kind of just found myself sort of, I guess, leading the kind of work that I ended up making my career. So it's been a very sort of you know strange journey. It's one that you can't really predict, and I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. Is that it's hard to know exactly what's going to happen, particularly when we're talking about technology, which is changing so rapidly.
Yeah, for sure. So why do you think that truth is so important? Like correct information is so important, and that misinformation and disinformation are such a big issue, especially right now.
So it's a big question. I mean, why is truth important? That's an interesting philosophical question, right? If we're talking in philosophical terms, kind of we'd say, what is the normative value of truth, right? Why ought we aim for truth? That's a big question, but I think for me, it's about being able to share a world with others in a way where we can get things done and that we can pursue things like justice, right?
Hmm.
If you and I can't agree on what is real or what is the case or what is true, it's going to be very, very hard for us to cooperate, to reach consensus, to get things done, right? So in that respect, truth is the bedrock of most of our daily lives. Now, obviously, truth is an interesting phrase because people talk about their truth, right? So it's not necessarily a term which is as solid or as concrete as a lot of people think. But for me, the idea of a shared truth, of some kind of universal referent in the world that we can all sort of agree on, is really important. Um, but disinformation and misinformation, and of course, disinformation being intentional deception, misinformation being unintentional deception,
Hmm.
um, have become a huge issue recently in the digital age. And that's not to say that disinformation hasn't been used for a long, long time in warfare and in other guises in politics and so on. But I think social media in particular really provided a framework that people can exploit, um, to spread disinformation to specific groups, to algorithmically silo people into certain spaces so that they only hear what they want to hear. And then, of course, when it comes to digital media, like video, images, and so on, the ability to edit those pieces of content in a way that makes them kind of deceptive or are fully synthetically generated is really changing the game. So, we need to aim for truth. I feel that's really critical.
Hmm.
But in terms of, the challenges to it, they're only becoming greater, and the cracks in the kind of fabric of our society and how we think about truth is also being revealed as quite vulnerable, unfortunately.
Hmm. So, you just listed in multiple ways that social media and technology can make like misinformation a bigger issue. So what is something that in your opinion that like people can do to in their daily lives to like avoid or like tackle these misinformation as like regular people themselves?
Mm. So it's a really important question about what can I do, right? What can the individual do with
Hmm.
this huge problem, which is much bigger than us as individuals, right?
Yeah.
What can we do? Um, I think in some respects, Annie, the fact that we're asking that question is the start, right? Um, there are a lot of people out there, and this is where disinformation really has its impact, who
Hmm.
don't ask that question, who don't want to critically reflect on the information they receive,
Hmm.
um, and actually kind of want to live in these sort of siloed versions of reality that only conform to what they want to hear and what they believe. And so the fact that you're asking, well, what can we do? It's like, well, if someone's asking that question, that's already really positive. The people that we actually really kind of want to help most are ironically those who just don't ask that question and perhaps don't want to be helped. Um, but in terms of what can people who do want to get better do, well, there's a couple of approaches. I mean, as mentioned, I work on deepfakes and generative media and how these technologies are interfacing with our daily lives, and in the context of disinformation over the last year, we've seen this really massively grow as people are kind of creating a lot of kind of voice clones of, for example, your president Joe Biden saying silly things, but then also some less silly things. Same with some other applications with face swapping or changing people's lip movements, for example.
Hmm.
And so, because the landscape's moving so quickly, a lot of people are trying to figure out, well, how can I spot this is fake or not?
Yeah.
Um, and it's really difficult because we want to empower people such as yourself, Annie, to say, well, look, this is what you can do to spot deep fakes and tell if this is real or not to inform your view of the world. But
Hmm.
then the other side of things, if I give you some tips as how to spot deep fakes, there's no guarantee that even in a week, those tips will still be relevant because the technology might have evolved. And then you're sitting there thinking, I'm confident I know how to spot this fake video. It's not blinking, or it's doing this or that. But actually the technology's moved on and your framing hasn't. So I think it's important to help people understand that it's really hard to spot fakes with the naked eye.
Hmm.
And we don't want that what can I do question to sort of be reductive in the way that we then think about the content that we consume and how we look for fakes. So I think basically off the back of that, what we should be doing is pretty standard due diligence on information. Check
Hmm.
your sources, right? Maybe when there's breaking news, don't turn to Twitter. Maybe wait for one of the big platforms or the respected journalistic organizations to release something which has been fact checked and verified. If something seems too good to be true, as usual, it probably is. So, think about whether you're reacting to something because it is something that you want to hear, right? For example, recently there was this attempted coup or this mutiny in Russia, and a lot of people were kind of really getting excited about this because they thought it could be the downfall of Putin, and there was lots of rumors spreading around about what was happening and how Putin was reacting and so on. And there wasn't really much in the way of evidence, but I saw a lot of people who I respect and who I see as measured and thoughtful people, perhaps reacting in ways that they wouldn't have done if it was the flip side, and we were talking about a new invasion front in Ukraine, for example. So just keeping that in mind. Is this information that is kind of playing to your biases? Is this from a reliable source? Is this looking too good to be true? And in the case of, for example, TikTok as well, it's like maybe watch it a couple of times if it's a video. Try and just let yourself sit with the information. So those are a few tips I would give.
Hmm. Yeah. So, that's like what like individuals can do. So, uh, looking more into like the field and like experts like yourself, like what's something that like people in the field like do that may be different than like individuals that are not in the field do to like fight against misinformation caused by AI and technology?
Hmm. So it's a good question because when you're talking about what experts do differently, I mean, on many levels, there's not a huge amount that we do differently in terms of when it comes to assessing this content. I mean, I might have, for example, a little bit more expertise when it comes to analyzing images or videos, knowing signals to look for, and people that I can then cross-reference this with and discuss it with to get a sense of, you know, is this real? Is this fake? Or how confident are we?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but in terms of, the same problem applies to me. In 5 years' time, I don't think with my naked eye, I will be able to spot deepfakes very well. I sometimes get it wrong still now. So, you know, it's one of those situations where realistically, we need to be putting less emphasis on individual people, whether they're everyday people or experts, such as myself,
Mm-hmm.
and start placing emphasis on platforms and the people developing these tools to say, look, you're building the tools that are facilitating misuse, right? They may not be designed for bad purposes, but they're being used in this way. And the same for social media, right? Your platforms are hosting deceptive content. That's not your intention, but that's how they're being used or misused. And so we need to say to them, it's not fair to expect you, Annie, or me, Henry, to to become a digital Sherlock Holmes, right? Nor is it fair to expect people who aren't so tech savvy, like elderly people, perhaps, or people whose jobs don't involve any AI or technology, to become experts either. And so we need to basically be saying, look, you need to be doing a much better job of building safer tools that restrict this kind of content or make it harder to create. And platforms, you need to be doing a better job of actually, you know, regulating your users, policies, and so on to make sure that, these kinds of fake, deceptive pieces of content are either flagged or removed or downranked, essentially are taken care of. And right now, unfortunately, we're not seeing a huge amount of that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, for just like a really broad question, I guess, but there are many like downsides to like AI, but I'm just curious, and you specifically like work on like deep fakes and stuff like that. So, I want to hear from like you. Do you think the benefits of AI um, like are like greater than like the harms that come from it, or like that,
Mm.
because since you're like you already like focus on like kind of like the negative side kind of, and then so I want to like hear from your perspective.
That's a great question, Annie. Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one too, because I think when we're looking at the current hype around tools like Chat GPT or Mid Journey for generating images or 11 Labs for generating synthetic voices, when you're listening to the people who are evangelizing and promoting these tools, they're often saying, this is an amazing productivity tool for businesses, or this will help you grow your revenues, or maybe for an artist, this helps you make a cool new image or a new way of creating adverts, right?
Mhm.
But then when you think about the flip side, it's like, oh, these tools are also scaling disinformation. They're creating non-consensual intimate image abuse against women. They're causing new waves of cybersecurity problems. And then to your point at the beginning about truth, they're furthering this kind of erosion of trust in media and society. At the moment, I think on the generative side of things, the balance is quite clearly more towards negative uses than it is towards positive uses in terms of impact.
Mhm.
Having said that, I don't think we should take a reductive approach of saying, well, it's either it's so bad we have to get rid of it all, or it's so good that we have to let everything through, right? I think we need to have a more nuanced view around AI and saying, well, look, people who are saying that this tool is amazing for advertising are right. It is. It can be really powerful. It can help businesses or ad professionals, build better campaigns, sure. But they can't say that as a way to dismiss concerns about real harms affecting different groups or society.
Yeah.
And on the balance of things, they're more impactful. And so that's why it's even more important that if you're going to use these tools as an advertiser, for example, you've got to make sure you're using them responsibly.
Mm.
It's why we need to make sure legislation reflects that too. Because banning technology just doesn't really work, particularly when we're talking about code, right, which anyone can replicate if they're good enough, or rebuild. So for me, the balance is quite clearly in generative media and generative AI towards negative in terms of more impact. But that doesn't mean that we should ignore the positives or say that the positives don't exist.
Mm.
One area I think I'd just like to point to, which is really quite inspiring, is how generative AI and generative tools are being used to help with things like accessibility. So giving personalized synthetic voices to people who have lost ability to speak, for example,
Mm.
or providing really, really good translation of voices so people can access more content in different languages.
Mm.
Or, even synthetic sign language, right? Imagine an algorithm listening to what I'm saying right now, and then in the corner of this screen, a little figure popping up, signing what I'm saying in real time so people who have got hearing impairments can understand what I'm saying. So there are really positive uses, both commercially, pro-socially, and creatively. But we need to make sure that the harms are taken seriously, and we don't let the kind of the hype around those uses take over, which I fear at the moment it might be doing slightly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I guess where do you see like AI in the next however many years? That's also a pretty general question, but
um, I'm gonna be mean, Annie. I'm gonna ask you to specify a certain amount of years. Um, I
yeah.
mean, if I was going to say, let's say 5 years. I mean, I've been working in this space for about 6 years, looking at deepfakes and generative content,
Mhm.
and the amount of progress has been pretty astonishing, particularly in the last year. I talk about things often in this space around three key metrics, and that's realism, efficiency, and accessibility. So realism is how good is the output, right? How realistic does it look? How dynamic is it? For example, can you make someone's body move as opposed to just their head? What kind of capabilities do these tools have?
Mhm.
Um, Efficiency is how much data is needed and how much computational power is needed. So can this be run on a domestic PC as opposed to a supercomputer? Do I need an entire terabyte of images, or do I just need one photo to make an output, a synthetically generated output? And then accessibility, which has really driven the current kind of explosion, is, well, yeah, who can access it? Is this like a tool that I can create memes on TikTok with, by just pressing a couple of buttons? Or is this something that still requires a sense of expertise to create really fine grain professional outputs? And I think we're going to probably see an increasing march of accessibility. So more and more powerful tools reaching into the hands, the phones, the desktops of everyday consumers. And that will drive, as we've seen with tools like ChatGPT, a massive adoption and normalization of these tools,
Mhm.
for better or for worse. I think we will see a move towards open source software. So that's software which is freely available to download and you can edit and build on top of it. I think we're going to see open source really explode as well. And I think we're going to start to see perhaps interfacing of zero or no code, that is, people being able to develop without actually coding on top of these applications. So
Mhm.
everyday people can now perhaps, as we say, fork off of an open source code to build something for them without necessarily needing to be experts at coding, precisely using tools like language models. And then with realism, the direction is pretty clear. Things are getting much more realistic every month. Every single update for Midjourney or for Runway's Gen 2 image video generator, are more and more impressive. And so, as mentioned earlier, it's not going to be the case for that much longer, in my view, that the everyday person is going to be able to easily spot fake content, AI generated content, which is why it is so important that we have this kind of critical inoculation towards deepfakes, right? That we're aware of them, that we know they're around, and that, as I said, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is, or if something seems so bad, it also probably is as well. So, 5 years we will see, but I think we're going to see much more of the same in terms of those three key metrics.
Mhm. All right, so those are all like my questions before like two closing ones. So is there anything else you would like to add?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's one question or one area I'd like to touch on in disinformation, which is um, a lot of people make a lot of noise about deepfakes themselves, but actually one of the most pernicious aspects of deepfaking is that the idea itself is now enough to discredit a piece of original or real footage, right? There's a concept called the liar's dividend. This is the idea that when everything could be a deepfake, anything could be a deepfake, right?
Mm,
And so we've seen that in the context of US politics, with politicians dismissing voice recordings of them are real or that videos of them are real. We've seen this around the world as well in places like Pakistan. And it's a really big challenge because it essentially poisons the well, right? The idea creates plausible deniability for bad actors to say, well, look, that's not me, that's a deepfake, even if they know full well that that was them.
mm,
And the burden of proof may move from them having to prove that it's fake to the individual having to prove that it's real that's accusing them. And that would be a really dangerous place to be. So I think it's really important that people recognize that they might see people crying deepfake more often about footage which is inconvenient to them.
mm. Yeah, I haven't thought about that in that way. That's
Hmm.
very
It's
interesting.
a big one. Yeah, it's a big one for disinformation.
Yeah. All right. So, just for fun and like for the closing, so is there the first one is like what like inspires you like in life, whether that's like a person, idea, like
Hmm.
book, anything, and then if you have any advice for people, especially like young people, and teens, youth. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, sure. So what inspires me? Um, in work, I think what inspires me is fundamentally trying to help people. It's when it comes to combating image abuse against women, it's about seeing those laws coming in and seeing victims get justice.
Hmm.
So a large part of my work does focus on trying to make the world a better place, and that's a pretty good motivator. Um, but also I think just a sense of curiosity, just kind of wanting to learn, just wanting to know more. And it's a classic case that the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And you understand the complexity of the world, both in its beauty and kind of sometimes its frustration, as a very complex place to be. But I would say, yeah, trying to make things better for people who have suffered perhaps, and then also helping people understand the complexity of a world, which is often quite exhausting to be in. In terms of advice, I always feel weird giving advice to young people about what I would say they should do, because I didn't really have a plan for what happened. I kind of thought I wanted to go into academia as a philosophy professor,
Hmm.
um, and I'm very glad I didn't. I don't think I'd have done very well there. But I remember very clearly, getting an offer for a PhD, but not getting the funding. So I didn't win a scholarship. I got put on the waiting list. And I was really, really, really depressed about that. But actually, it's worked out pretty well. And I'm actually incredibly glad now that I didn't get that funding. And I look at that and I'm like, oh, thank goodness, my life would be so different. And I'd probably be a much less happy person. So I think the message for me would be moments that feel like the end of the world, whether that's missing out on a job, maybe not getting the exam results that you were wanting, maybe not getting into the college that you really wanted to get into. They feel, they feel, these moments can feel really, you know, all encompassing and bad and catastrophic. Um, but a lot of the time I look back on those moments now and I say, well, thank God it went that way because I wouldn't have met that person or I wouldn't have had that experience. Um, so for me, if you work hard, you're curious, you have a vision, or you at least have a drive that, as I said, for me, is curiosity and wanting to kind of change the world for the better, that will put you in good stead. And you know, remember moments in the past where something's happened that perhaps you were sad about at the time, but actually you're like, oh, thank goodness, because I wouldn't be here today if that had happened. So yeah, I know it's hard in the moment, but that's something that I try to keep in mind.
Awesome. Thank you for those, and thank you for your time here and for your insights. They're very interesting, and I learned a lot. So thank you.
My pleasure, Annie. Well, thank you for having me and keep on doing this great work. Really impressive stuff.
Thank you. All right.
Cool.
Take care.
Okay. Awesome.